Opposition parties are appealing for discussions on the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill. Now, this comes amid threats of legal action by some, and the bill changes the funding formula of how political parties and independents represented in legislatures receive allocations from state coffers. Let's now speak to Tselane, who's the chair of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, who's joining us live now. Mr. Tselane, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with unpacking the significance of this particular bill and the significance and the move then to try and finalize things before the May polls.
Thank you very much for having me. The bill is significant in many respects. Firstly, as you may recall, at a time when the multi-party fund, a democracy fund was launched, the independents were not participating in the process. Now, following the Constitutional Court judgment, which basically arranged that the independent candidates can now participate in the elections as independents and not through membership of a political party. An arrangement had to be made in order to be able to cover them, because the Party Funding Act did not cover independents in the previous occasion. So the fund is important to the extent that now it is being extended to cover the independent candidates, particularly those who will be able to get a seat in parliament, but also to make sure that everybody is bound by the same provision. And some of the amendments, of course, deal with the issue of the threshold, as well as the issue of the amount of money that can be allocated to the multi-party and independent democracy fund by parliament. And in particular, this power now rests with the president after a resolution from parliament.
Now, there are some, of course, on the opposition benches who are saying that, the foot must be taken off the pedal, and also the UDM, for example, describing it as selfish, while the ANC is saying that it is a race against time and things need to be finalized before the election. I wonder then, when it comes to all the boxes that needed to be ticked here, in your view, in this particular process, were they all done?
Well, I think Parliament really delayed in terms of making sure that this aspect is catered for, particularly because now, as you know, that the date of the elections has already been declared, the election timetable is already in place, political parties and independents have already submitted their names, the names of their candidates to the Electoral Commission. This is supposed to have, ideally, is supposed to have been dealt with long before the election timetable kicks in. But there is no way that we could actually proceed with the old act, whereas now you've got new entrants in the political space who are not actually covered by the provisions of the Party Funding Act.
So what happens then, should they decide to take this, this matter to the courts, especially in light of some of the developments? I mean, you look at what the court had to say and the processes thereof and what you've just explained now when it comes to, the timetable. So should this matter then reach the courts, is it likely to possibly be thrown out? Of course, we're not anticipating or even preempting the ruling, but what is your reading of, should things end up there?
Well, if it is taken to court now, it basically means that the independent candidates are not bound by the provisions of the Act, and therefore they can raise as much money as they want, and that they don't have to account to Parliament about where the source of funding comes from. And they're going to operate basically outside the confines of the law, well, the current law on party funding. And it would mean that the current law that is applicable to political parties is the one that is actually going to be applicable until such time that there is a law that governs the operations of the Funding Act, whether for political parties and independents, or whether it is going to remain as is. But there's got to be a framework, and the framework that is applicable right now is the one that is in operation, which which excludes the independents.
There's some serious risks then if they are not going to be accounting as to, the amount of money and also accounting for their own books. These pose some serious risks, particularly when you look at what has been happening in the past, especially around the issues of funding.
Of course, it's there are serious implications, but one of those is that even if a party, rather an independent, gets a seat in parliament, they will not actually be getting any funding from the fiscus or from the multi-party funding act. So it is something that is going to be covering only political parties, as is currently the case.
And that could mean then that the playing fields are not going to be leveled, and then that could result in yet another court challenge, I suppose.
Definitely. Of course, the independents benefit in the sense that they are not bound by any regulations in terms of the amount of money they can get, as well as the threshold that is applicable to all other political parties. And at the same time, they have a difficulty in a sense that they will not actually be benefiting from the money that comes from the fiscal. So even though they're benefiting in terms of not being bound by the process, but once they get a seat, they will be excluded from the allocation that will be coming from the fiscus.
So how does this process then unfold from now? Can the president still send it back, or is it a done deal once his signature is on it?
Once the president's signature is on it, it means it is the law that is going to be applicable.
And can he still decide, though, to send it back?
Of course, the president has got the discretion to take the bill back to parliament if he's not satisfied with certain provisions, or if he still wants to study certain things in the bill that makes his office uncomfortable. So in that case, as I've suggested earlier on, the law that is going to be applicable is the current law, which only covers political parties that are represented in parliament.
It's going to be interesting to see how this one actually does pan out, because we've seen quite a strong reaction to this from some of the opposition parties. And listening to what you have to say, there's a lot to consider when it comes to this particular bill. But let's see then which way it does go. Thank you so much for your time and for putting us in the picture. There was Tselane, Chair of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa.